There is a moment every single day that decides the entire shape of your life, and almost nobody notices it happening. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. Nobody films it. It happens in the 2 seconds after your alarm goes off, when your eyes are still adjusting to the light and your mind whispers one small, harmless-sounding sentence, just 5 more minutes. That sentence feels like nothing. It feels smaller than a decision. But that sentence, repeated enough mornings in a row, is the exact reason most people never become who they were capable of becoming. Not because they lacked talent, not because life was unfair to them, but because comfort, quiet, polite, reasonable-sounding comfort talk them out of their own future one snooze button at a time. Here's something almost nobody wants to hear, so I'm going to say it plainly. You are not failing because you don't have a big enough goal. You are not failing because you haven't found the right book, the right routine, or the right morning ritual. You are failing, if you're failing, because you keep making comfortable decisions instead of disciplined ones, and comfort has quietly destroyed more dreams than every failure in human history combined. Failure at least teaches you something. Comfort just lets you disappear a little more every day, so slowly that you don't even notice it happening until you look up one day and 10 years are gone. Think about 2 people standing at the exact same starting line. Same education. Same 24 hours in a day. Same opportunities walking past them. 10 years later, one of them is living a life they're proud of, and the other is still asking, quietly, in private, why not me? It wasn't talent. Talent is common. Go to any coffee shop, and you'll find people with more raw talent than half the successful people you admire. It wasn't luck either, although luck likes to take credit for things it never actually built. The difference, every single time, comes down to one unglamorous, unsexy word that nobody wants printed on a motivational poster because it doesn't sound exciting. Discipline. My name is Daniel Hale, and for the last several years, I've spent my time studying something most people spend their whole lives avoiding, which is the quiet, invisible architecture behind people who actually finish what they start. Not the people who talk about their goals at dinner parties. The people who are still working on those goals long after the excitement wore off, long after nobody was watching, long after it stopped feeling exciting and started feeling like just another Tuesday. And what I've learned is this. Discipline isn't punishment. It isn't some harsh drill sergeant screaming at you to suffer. Discipline is something much quieter and much more powerful than that. And once you actually understand what it is, you will never look at your own mornings the same way again. Because here's the truth, almost nobody tells you. Without discipline, opportunity becomes wasted potential. Without discipline, intelligence becomes nothing more than trivia you can recite at parties. Without discipline, even talent becomes a kind of entertainment, something people admire for a moment and then forget, because it never turned into anything lasting. Discipline is the one ingredient that takes everything else you have, your intelligence, your talent, your connections, your opportunities, and actually turns it into results. Not because life is cruel, because results have always respected consistency more than they respect intensity. A person who shows up imperfectly every single day will always, eventually, outperform a person who shows up perfectly once in a while. If any part of what I just said made something in your chest tighten a little, if you recognized yourself in that person standing at the starting line, still asking, why not me? I want you to do something for me right now, before you keep watching. Write one word in the comments below. Just one. The thing you've been putting off. Your body of work, your degree, your business, your health, your peace, whatever it is. I read every single comment on this channel personally, and I want to know what you're building. Because the fact that you're still here, still watching, still searching for answers at this hour, tells me you haven't given up yet. And that matters more than you know. Now, here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. Because what I'm about to walk you through is not another list of productivity tips you'll forget by tomorrow afternoon. I'm going to show you exactly why discipline feels so difficult. The invisible conversation happening in your mind every single morning that you've never been taught to notice. And one story in particular, coming up in just a few minutes, that completely changed the way I understand what it actually means to become someone you can trust. Because that, more than money, more than recognition, More than anything else discipline gives you is the real prize hiding underneath all of this. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Let's start with the problem itself, because most people have never actually named it correctly. And you cannot fix something you haven't clearly identified. The problem is not laziness. I want to be very direct about that, because laziness is a lazy explanation. Nobody wakes up wanting to waste their life. Nobody sets an alarm hoping to disappoint themselves. The real problem is something much sneakier, and it hides inside a single, seemingly harmless habit. The habit of waiting to feel ready before you act. Most people are operating on a hidden belief system that sounds something like this. I will start when I feel motivated. I will commit fully once I feel confident. I will show up completely once the conditions are right. It sounds reasonable. It even sounds responsible. But it is, quietly, the single biggest reason ambitious, intelligent, capable people spend years circling their own potential without ever landing on it. Because motivation is not reliable. Motivation is a mood, and moods change with sleep, with weather, with what somebody said to you in a hallway. If your entire plan for building a life depends on a mood cooperating with you every single day, you have built your future on the least stable foundation available to you. Discipline works completely differently, and this is the part that changes everything once you actually understand it. Discipline doesn't wait to feel ready. Discipline decides first and lets the feeling catch up later, sometimes hours later, sometimes not until the task is already halfway finished. Motivation says, I'll work once I feel like it. Discipline says, I'll work until I feel like it. Those two sentences sound almost identical, but they produce completely different lives, because one of them requires permission from your emotions, and the other one doesn't ask permission from anyone. Here's where it gets personal, because this problem doesn't just cost you productivity. It costs you something far more expensive, and most people never connect the dots. Every single time you make yourself a promise and break it, something happens quietly underneath the surface. You say, I'll wake up early tomorrow. Tomorrow comes. You hit snooze. You say, I'll finally start eating better this week. Wednesday arrives, and the plan is already abandoned. Each of those broken promises seems small on its own, almost forgettable. But your mind is keeping score, whether you realize it or not, and the message it receives over and over is this: I cannot fully trust what I say to myself. That is the real damage, not the missed workout, not the unfinished project. The erosion of self-trust, one broken promise at a time, until eventually a person stops believing their own commitments are worth taking seriously, even when they desperately want to. And here's the quiet tragedy hiding inside that pattern. Once someone stops trusting themselves, they start looking outward for validation instead, needing other people's approval to feel like they're doing something right, because the one voice that should have carried the most weight, their own, has gone quiet from being ignored too many times. I think about this every time I remember a conversation I had with a man I met at a rehabilitation gym a few years ago. A physical therapist named Owen, who had spent almost 2 decades helping people recover after major injuries. I asked him what separated the patients who fully recovered from the ones who never quite got back to where they used to be, expecting him to talk about the severity of the injury or the quality of the surgery. He said something I didn't expect. He said the biggest predictor wasn't the injury at all. It was whether the person did their exercises on the days they didn't feel like it. He told me, anyone can do rehab exercises on a good day. The recovery gets decided on the bad days, the days nobody's watching, the days the pain is bad and the motivation is worse, and the only thing left is a decision. That single sentence rearranged something in how I think about discipline, because it revealed the twist that most people never see coming. You don't actually need more motivation to change your life. You need fewer negotiations with yourself on the days you don't feel like showing up. The people who transform their lives are not the ones who feel like doing the work more often than everyone else. They are the ones who stopped requiring the feeling in the first place. And that single shift, small as it sounds, is the entire hinge that the rest of this conversation swings on. But here's something even more important than what I just told you, something I haven't fully explained yet, and it's coming up in the next few minutes. There is a specific moment, a specific kind of decision that determines whether a person becomes disciplined for a season or disciplined for life. And almost nobody talks about it because it isn't as exciting as talking about goals and vision boards. It has to do with what happens in your mind seconds before you act. And once you understand it, you'll start noticing it in yourself almost immediately. So let's go deeper into that moment, because this is where real change actually begins. Not in the big decisions, but in the seconds surrounding the small ones. Every single action you take is preceded by a conversation that happens so quickly you barely notice it's happening. One voice says, "Skip it today, just this once." Another voice answers, quietly, "You and I both know once becomes twice." One voice says, "You deserve to rest." Another replies, "You've been resting from this goal for months already." That conversation happens dozens of times a day. And here is the part that matters most. Whichever voice you listen to doesn't just decide that one action. It casts a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. And votes, repeated enough times, decide elections. Now let's talk about what actually works, because understanding the problem is only useful if it leads somewhere practical. The first shift, and it's a small one, is learning to separate discomfort from impossibility. Most people quit the moment something feels hard, because their brain interprets discomfort as a warning sign, a signal that something is wrong and should be stopped. But discomfort is not a warning sign when you're building something new. It's evidence that you're doing it correctly. Nobody has ever built strength, financial security, a skill, or a relationship without walking directly through a stretch of discomfort first. The people who succeed are not the people who found a way around the discomfort. They're the people who learned to keep moving while it was happening. The second shift is smaller and even more practical. And it's the one I'd ask you to actually try this week. Stop making promises to yourself that are too big to keep, and start making promises so small that breaking them would feel almost embarrassing. Not, "I will exercise every single day for an hour." Instead, "I will do 10 minutes. And if I want to stop after 10 minutes, I'm allowed to." That sounds too easy to matter, but here's what happens in practice. Most people, once they start the 10 minutes, keep going far longer, because the hardest part was never the exercise itself. It was the decision to begin. But even on the days you genuinely stop at 10 minutes, you kept the promise. And that is worth more than people realize. Because we already talked about what happens to a person who keeps their word to themselves, even in small things. Self-respect doesn't arrive through grand gestures. It accumulates, quietly, one kept promise at a time. I met a woman a few years back named Renata who ran a small bakery outside of Denver. And she told me something about her first 2 years in business that stuck with me long after our conversation ended. She said the bakery almost failed in year 1. Not because the bread wasn't good, but because she kept waiting for a week that felt calm enough to finally organize her finances properly. That week never came. There is no calm week in owning a small business. Eventually, she stopped waiting for the conditions to improve and instead gave herself 15 minutes every single night, no matter how exhausted she was, to update one page of numbers. 15 minutes. Some nights it turned into an hour. Some nights it was exactly 15 minutes and she closed the laptop. But within 4 months, for the first time since opening, she actually understood her own business. And she told me that 15 minutes a night did more for that bakery than any single decision she made in the entire first year. Here's the unexpected angle most people miss in a story like that. It wasn't the 15 minutes that mattered most. It was what those 15 minutes proved to her about herself. Every night she showed up for that small commitment. She was quietly collecting evidence that she was someone who follows through, and that evidence became the foundation for bigger and harder decisions later. Decisions that required a level of self-trust she wouldn't have had if she'd kept waiting for a calmer week that was never going to arrive. Discipline in small things is never really about the small thing. It's about who you're proving yourself to be, one quiet decision at a time, in a room where nobody else is keeping score but you. If you're watching this and thinking about the 15 minutes you could be giving to something that actually matters to you, I want you to hold on to that thought. Because in a few minutes, I'm going to walk you through the real root of why so many people struggle to keep even the small promises. And it has almost nothing to do with willpower. Willpower, in fact, might be the most overrated word in the entire self-improvement conversation. And once you understand why, You'll stop blaming yourself for something that was never really the problem in the first place. Here is the root cause almost nobody talks about. And once you hear it, a lot of your past struggles are going to make a lot more sense. Willpower is not a moral virtue. It is closer to a battery than a character trait. Every decision you make throughout the day, what to wear, what to eat, how to respond to a frustrating email, draws from the same limited reserve of mental energy. By the time evening arrives, most people have already spent the majority of that reserve on things that don't actually matter, which is exactly why the gym plans and the reading goals and the important conversations keep getting pushed to a version of the day when there's almost nothing left in the tank. This is the twist that reframes everything you thought you understood about discipline. The problem was never that you lack willpower. The problem is that you've been relying on willpower for tasks that should have been handled by structure instead. Willpower is meant for rare, unexpected moments, not for daily habits you're trying to build. If you need a fresh act of willpower every single day just to open a book or put on your running shoes, the system is broken, not you. The people who sustain discipline for years, not weeks, are not the people with superhuman willpower. They are the people who figured out how to remove the decision entirely so that the action becomes closer to a routine than a battle. This is why the gym clothes laid out the night before matter more than they sound like they should. This is why deciding you write for 20 minutes the moment your coffee finishes brewing, tied to something you already do automatically, works better than a vague goal to write sometime today. You are not weak for needing structure. You are human. And every disciplined person you admire, whether they talk about it publicly or not, has built some version of structure around themselves precisely because they understood that willpower alone was never going to be enough to carry them across years, only across a single afternoon. Now, if what I just explained gave you even one idea about how to remove a decision from your own day, something you've been relying on willpower for that structure could handle instead, that alone was worth the time you've spent watching this. And if it helped, even a little, I genuinely ask you to like this video and share it with someone in your life who's been white-knuckling their way through a goal using willpower alone. Because sometimes the most generous thing you can do for someone you care about is hand them a different way to think about the exact thing they've been quietly struggling with. But structure alone isn't the full answer. And here's where I want to slow down. Because this next part is the piece that changes how you see the entire picture. Structure removes the need for constant willpower, but it doesn't answer a deeper question, which is why some people build the structure and stick with it for years, while other people build the exact same structure and abandon it within a month. The difference isn't discipline itself, it's identity. And almost nobody talks about this part because it's less concrete than a morning routine, but it might be the single most important idea in this entire video. A person who says, "I'm trying to become someone who exercises," is quietly leaving the door open to fail, because trying implies the outcome is still uncertain. A person who says, "I am someone who exercises," even on the days they don't feel like it, has closed that door. Not through arrogance, but through a quiet, repeated decision to see themselves differently. Your mind is constantly searching for evidence to support whatever identity you keep repeating to yourself, consciously or not. If you keep telling yourself you're someone who struggles with consistency, your mind will happily supply evidence for that story every single time you slip up. But if you start telling yourself, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, that you are someone who finishes what they start, your mind begins hunting for evidence of that instead. And over time, the evidence it finds becomes the person you actually are. Let me tell you about a man named Preston, someone I met while researching this exact idea, who worked as an air traffic controller for almost 30 years before retiring. It's a job where a single lapse in attention can have consequences most of us will never fully understand. And I asked him once how he managed to stay that sharp, shift after shift, year after year, without the weight of it eventually breaking him down. He said something I didn't expect. He said the job never actually got easier. What changed was that he stopped seeing precision as something he had to force himself into, and started seeing it as simply who he was in that room. He told me, the moment I started thinking of myself as someone who forgets things, I would have become that person within a year. So instead, every single day, whether he felt sharp or exhausted, he walked into that control room already having decided who he was going to be for the next 8 hours, before a single plane ever appeared on his radar. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because it reveals something surprising about the entire structure of discipline that we've been building throughout this conversation. The habits, the small promises, the removed decisions, all of it eventually becomes the evidence your mind uses to answer one quiet, constant question running in the background of your life. Who am I? Not who do I want to be someday. Who am I right now, based on what I actually do when nobody's applying pressure? And the uncomfortable truth is that most people are answering that question every single day through their actions, whether or not they've ever consciously asked it. Here's the emotional shift I want you to sit with for a moment. Because it's easy to hear all of this and still feel like discipline is some far-off destination you haven't earned the right to claim yet. It isn't. You don't need years of consistency before you're allowed to think of yourself as a disciplined person. You need today. One decision, made in the next 24 hours, that you follow through on, even though a part of you would rather not. That single decision doesn't prove you've changed forever, but it proves something quieter and, in its own way, more important. It proves that today, at least, the story you're telling yourself about who you are was actually true. I think about a phrase Preston used near the end of our conversation that I haven't been able to shake since. He said that most people are waiting for a single dramatic moment to prove to themselves that they've changed. Some big test, some visible achievement. But real change almost never announces itself that clearly. It shows up first in tiny, private moments that nobody else will ever witness. The extra 5 minutes you gave to something instead of walking away. The honest answer you gave instead of the comfortable one. The morning you got up, even though the excuse sitting right there would have been so easy to accept. Nobody claps for those moments. Nobody posts about them, but they are. Every single time. The actual moment the transformation happened, long before anyone on the outside noticed a single thing was different. That's the part almost nobody tells you about discipline. And it's the reason so many people give up too early. They're waiting to feel transformed before they believe they've transformed, when the truth runs in exactly the opposite direction. You don't feel different first, and then start acting differently. You act differently, in small, unglamorous, often invisible ways, and the feeling of being a different person arrives quietly afterward. Sometimes so gradually you don't even notice the exact day it happened. All you know is that one afternoon, you look up, and the version of yourself that used to negotiate with every excuse simply isn't there in the same way anymore. And what I want to walk you through next is the single idea, out of everything in this entire video, that I believe matters more than all the rest combined. Here's the strongest idea I have for you, the one I've been building toward this entire time. And I want you to really sit with it rather than just letting it pass by. Discipline was never really about achieving more. That's the version everyone sells. The version wrapped up in productivity and hustle and squeezing more out of every single hour. But underneath all of that, the actual gift discipline gives you has nothing to do with output at all. It's the quiet, steady experience of becoming someone you can trust. And once you have that, once your own word means something to you again, almost everything else in life gets easier to carry, because you're no longer fighting yourself on top of everything else you're already fighting. Think about how much energy gets spent, silently, by people who don't trust their own commitments. Every goal comes wrapped in a little bit of doubt. Every plan gets made half-heartedly, because some part of the person already suspects they'll abandon it the way they've abandoned things before. That doubt is exhausting, even when you can't quite name where it's coming from. But a person who has spent months, even just weeks, keeping small promises to themselves carries a completely different kind of energy into everything they do, because the question of whether they'll follow through has already been quietly answered over and over in ordinary moments nobody else witnessed. This is why I don't think discipline is really about becoming more productive, more impressive, or more accomplished, even though those things often follow. I think discipline is really about becoming peaceful with yourself, in a way that has nothing to do with circumstances going well. A disciplined person can face a hard season, a setback, an unexpected loss, and still feel steady underneath it. Not because the pain is any smaller, but because they've spent enough time proving to themselves that they follow through, that they trust themselves to keep showing up even here, even now, even when it's difficult. That kind of peace cannot be purchased, and it cannot be borrowed from someone else's success. It has to be built quietly, one kept promise at a time, by you, for you. So if there's one thing I want you to walk away with today, it's this. Stop waiting to feel ready, because that feeling was never going to arrive on its own. Stop measuring your progress only by results you can see, because the most important part of this entire process happens somewhere nobody else is watching. And stop believing that discipline is something reserved for a certain kind of person, someone naturally driven, someone born with more willpower than you. It isn't. Discipline is available to you starting in the next 24 hours, in one small promise, kept, for no other reason than because you said you would. My name is Daniel Hale, and if there's one thing I hope stays with you after watching this, it's the image of that first small promise, whatever it looks like for you, waiting on the other side of tomorrow morning. Not a dramatic transformation, just one decision, quietly kept, becoming the first piece of evidence in a story about yourself that you actually want to keep telling. That's how every single disciplined life you've ever admired actually began. Not with a grand leap, but with someone deciding, on an ordinary morning, much like the one you'll wake up to tomorrow, that they were finally going to become someone they could trust. If this video gave you something worth holding on to today, something worth carrying into tomorrow morning specifically, I'd ask you to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because there is a lot more of this conversation still ahead, and I would genuinely love to keep having it with you.